luchando cuerpo a cuerpo con la muerte, al borde del abismo, estoy clamando a Dios, y su silencio, retumbando, ahoga mi voz en el vacío inerte. Oh Dios, si he de morir, quiero tenerte despierto, y noche, noche, no sé cuándo oirás mi voz. Oh Dios, estoy hablando solo, arañando sombras para verte. Alzo la mano y tú me la cercenas. Abro los ojos, me los sajas vivos. Sed tengo y sal se vuelven tus arenas. Esto es ser hombre, horror a manos llenas. Ser y no ser, eternos fugitivos. Ángel con grandes alas de cadenas. So this is the second session of these Pan-Hispanic studies workshops that the Instituto Cervantes has very kindly organized. So all very welcome to this second session. As you know, obviously today we'll be talking about Blas de Otero and the Generación del 36. Blas de Otero is one of the main members of what has been known as the generation of 1936, la generación del 36. And if you've done a little bit of research on Blas de Otero, you can see how he looked. In there you can see his picture. He was born in Bilbao in 1916, so the wall is immersed in the First World War at the time. Spain did not take part in the First World War, but it provided amazing opportunities for Spain actually to invest a lot of money in the metal industry, and Blas de Otero's family made a lot of money. His father made a lot of money investing in metals and the metal industry. So he enjoyed a very wealthy childhood. It didn't last long, this is a big spoiler, but his first years of childhood were a very privileged one. He was educated, he had someone looking after him, an institutriz that was French, that would teach him French. So they were very, very privileged. However, what happened in the 1920s with the major economic crisis, the same way that his family had made a lot of money, they were in complete financial ruin. So the family moved from Bilbao to Madrid. His father was a doctor. His grandfather had been a very famous military man, a captain in the Navy. And so the family moved to Madrid to try to, do what they could with their financial situation, but it didn't help much. He had an older brother that started studying law, and this brother died when Blas de Otero was 13. Just 3 years later, Blas de Otero's father passed away, so when he was just 16, and he became basically the head of the family, and he was expected to study law as his deceased brother had done. So there was this expectation that he would continue the tradition, he would study law, he would take care of the family, he would provide for them. And this is something that was very hard for him. As a teenager, Blas de Otero had always wanted to be a poet. He had always published poetry in different magazines, in different publications. He had, presented poems in different concursos literarios. So he did really aspire to become a poet. So having to drop those aspirations and become a lawyer was not something that he fancied, but it was something that he had to do. So just after his father died, they moved back to Bilbao, and he started studying law and basically providing for the family, pretending that everything was fine. So within his bourgeois environment, the family was pretending that absolutely everything was absolutely fine. So he published in El Periódico El Pueblo Vasco just little poems that he had composed as a teenager. He won his first prize, El Centenario de Lope de Vega, so celebrating one of the centenaries. He just won an award, and for him that was a big recognition. And the Spanish Civil War in 1936 started when he had just finished his degree in law. And remember, this generation were direct actors of the Spanish Civil War, so they had to take part in it. In fact, Blas de Otero joined the Batallones Vascos, so the Republican side, but when Bilbao was conquered by the Francoist troops, he was sent to Levante. When the war is over, he starts working as a lawyer in a company, in a metal industry company. His first book, you don't have the picture there. I just added a few books there. His first book was Cántico Espiritual. I think I mentioned it yesterday, with clear references to San Juan de la Cruz. And in there we can start to see someone who, you know, is religious, but has some contradictions, that he's trying to make sense of these religious contradictions. He was very unhappy working as a lawyer in that company, and in 1943 he abandons his job as a lawyer and moves back to Madrid to study Filosofía y Letras, to study philosophy and letters, the degree. And in there, he meets and starts to be heavily influenced by Dámaso Alonso and Vicente Aleixandre, two of the members of the generation of 27 that had remained in Spain. The poor thing gets called back to Bilbao because one of his sisters is extremely ill, so he has to abandon everything, go back to Bilbao, and this for him is too much of a sacrifice. So he has a mental crisis. He spends time in a mental hospital. So it's not easy for him, let's say. He suffers from a very serious depression. But this doesn't change his desire, his aspirations to become a poet. And this all comes into fruition in the book that you've got there, the first book. You've got the portada in there, Ángel fieramente humano, this fiercely human angel. It's this book where he sort of resolves in a literary manner this sort of crisis that he has been suffering in the 40s. So in the middle of feeling completely alone and isolated, anguished, full of doubts, full of question, this is his answer, or maybe not his answer, but his ways of trying to find an answer to all this. We see in here how his religious beliefs are evolving, and how, you know, he becomes a different man who wants to live of being a poet. He wants to work as a poet. So the next poem he writes is Redoble de Conciencia. Maybe you can see them better in there. In 1951, this is the poem that he publishes. Then he publishes Pido la paz y la palabra, and then at the end of 1958, the first two books are reworked, okay, in this Ancia, yeah, which has the first two letters of Ángel Fieramente Humano and the last three ones of Redoble de Conciencia. But there is something crucial that happens between writing this existential poetry, yeah, of Ángel Fieramente Humano and Redoble de Conciencia, and Pido la paz y la palabra. And that is that in 1952, Blas de Otero makes one of the most relevant decisions of his life. For the first time ever, he leaves Spain. He leaves Spain and goes to Paris. And it's in Paris, I think I did mention it yesterday, that he becomes acquainted with communist poets, that he has access to new readings. He reads social poets. Basically, a new world opens up in front of him. So he now interprets life in a more Marxist way, if you want, and where he starts envisioning a society where everyone can sort of live in harmony, live in harmony, and where society can be based in fairness, where everyone is equal, where there is solidarity between individuals. So that's quite important for him. This is what gives his poetry the social twist, what separates Ancia, the reworking of Ángel Fieramente Humano and Redoble de Conciencia, into Pido la paz y la palabra. Look at the title, I ask for peace and the right to speak. Even the title sounds a lot more social. So in a way, with the social poetry, he finds the moral justification to write poetry. Yeah. So now poetry becomes the justification that he needs, because he finds this social aspect of it that entitles him to do what he wants.
No guilty.
Yes. And actually, when he comes back from Paris, he realizes that if he wants to write this social poetry that speaks to and for the Spanish population, he needs to know the Spanish population. And after coming back from Paris, he embarks on different trips around Spain, and talks to people and just meets people and just tries to find, what's worrying them, what is important for them. So this trip to Paris was absolutely life-changing for Blas de Otero and his poetry, because it allowed him to access new readings that otherwise wouldn't have been available to him, but also allowed him to realize what he needed to do to take his poetry a step further. And that was not being a poet in isolation, just worrying about his own problems, but getting out, talking to people and finding what the concerns of the population were. And that was absolutely crucial. And obviously, it wasn't easy to live in Spain at the time, and he did have problems with censorship. Funnily enough, Pido la paz y la palabra was more problematic for censorship than Ángel Fieramente Humano and Redoble de Conciencia, even though it was published later. But in that book, censorship forced him to change words like God, guerra. So there were loads of things that he needed to change a little bit in Pido la paz y la palabra that he hadn't had to do before. Although, to be fair, in Ancia, some of the poems that had been allowed to be published in the previous editions had to be reworked, which is quite ironic. It was years later, but then censorship caught up with, I'm not sure why we allowed this to be published. Let's forbid it now. So he did have problems with censorship. Blas de Otero did travel to other countries later on. So in the 60s, he traveled to China to Cuba. He was starting to be a well-known poet at the time. So obviously all of this was very, very important, made his poetry even more social, as we can see in other of his collections, like En Castellano, Que trata de España. Que trata de España, I think a third of the book was abolished by the censorship. It was published outside of Spain, but Blas de Otero always had an issue with publishing works outside of Spain. He always said that he was writing for Spanish people. So what was the point in publishing works, complete works without censorship outside of Spain, if he was writing for the Spanish people, which is quite poignant, I think. But anyway, he died in 1979 of cancer. But the nice thing about this is that, unlike many authors who had to go into exile, who brought, other authors of the generation of 1936, he was able to see the transition to democracy. Yeah, and actually, he took part in the democratic election campaigns, reading his poems. So at least he did see Spain living the post-war period behind the dictatorship behind. You've got in there one of his, the sentences that make him very, very well known. La poesía debe demostrar hermandad con la tragedia vivida y luego lo antes posible intentar superarla. So poetry must show brotherhood with living tragedy, and afterward, very soon, try to rise above it. Creo en el hombre. He visto espaldas astilladas a trallazos, almas cegadas avanzando a brincos, Españas a caballo del dolor y del hambre. Y he creído. Creo en la paz. He visto altas estrellas, llameantes ámbitos amanecientes, incendiando ríos hondos, caudal humano hacia otra luz. He visto y he creído. Creo en ti, patria. Digo lo que he visto. Relámpagos de rabia, amor en frío y un cuchillo chillando haciéndose pedazos de pan. Aunque hoy hay solo sombra, he visto y he creído.